There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Khaled Kiari, Assistant Secretary General for Middle East, Asia, and the Pacific, Departments of Political and Peace-Building Affairs and Peace Operations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Shira Efron, Director of Research at Israel's Policy Forum, and Mr. Michael Levy, brother of Or Levy, who has been held hostage by Hamas. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Chiari.
Madam President, members of the Security Council, since the submission of the Secretary General's written report on Security Council Resolution 2334, hostilities and violence have continued throughout the occupied Palestinian territory. In the Gaza Strip, hostilities between Israel Defense Forces and Hamas and other armed Palestinian groups, including heavily Israeli bombardments through the Strip, have resulted in heavy casualties. In the occupied West Bank, high levels of violence persist amid ongoing Israeli operations, exchanges with armed Palestinians, settler-related violence, and Palestinian attacks against Israel. Among other deadly strikes in Gaza from 14 to 15 December, at least 69 Palestinians, including women and children, were reportedly killed in 4 Israeli strikes on schools sheltering IDPs in Gaza City, Beit Hanun, and Khan Yunis, including 20 killed in an airstrike hitting an UNRWA school in Al-Mawazi, Khan Yunis. The Israel Defense Forces say they were targeting Hamas militants. More than 250 Palestinians have been killed in such strikes in Gaza over the past week, according to the Gaza Ministry of Health. The death toll of this war continues to mount. Since October 7, 2023, more than 45,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, according to the Ministry of Health, and over 1,700 Israeli and foreign nationals have been killed in attacks in or originating from Gaza, according to Israeli sources. In the occupied West Bank, on 12 December, an Israeli boy was killed in a shooting attack on a bus near the A1 Qadr junction in the occupied West Bank, south of Jerusalem. Israeli authorities say that the Palestinian perpetrator later turned himself in. The same day, Israeli forces reportedly killed a Palestinian man in an exchange of fire in Balata refugee camp near Nablus. Serious clashes have also taken place between Palestinian armed groups in the occupied West Bank and Palestinian security forces since the written report, particularly in Jenin camp following a Palestinian arrest operation and the seizure of Palestinian Authority vehicles by militants. Over several days, Palestinian security forces have killed an unarmed 19-year-old and detained numerous Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad militants, while the clashes have caused significant damage to the camp. Madam President, I will now highlight some of the Secretary General's observations regarding the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334. I once again strongly condemn the horrific attacks by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups in Israel on 7 October 2023 and the continued holding of more than 100 hostages in Gaza. Nothing can justify these acts of terror. All remaining hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. I remain appalled that there are reasonable grounds to believe that hostages may be subject to ongoing sexual violence and abuse. While in captivity, hostages must be treated humanly and allowed to receive visits and assistance from the Red Cross. I reiterate that there is no justification for the deliberate killing, maiming, torture, and abduction of civilians and other protected persons, nor using sexual violence against them. The use of human shields and the firing of indiscriminate rockets toward Israel population centers are violations of international humanitarian law and must cease. Turning to the situation in Gaza, a ceasefire is long overdue. The continued collective punishment of the Palestinian people is unjustifiable. The relentless bombardment of Gaza by Israeli forces, the larger number of civilian casualties, the blanket destruction of Palestinian neighborhoods, and the worsening humanitarian situation are horrific. The widespread devastation and deprivation resulting from Israel's military operations in North Gaza, especially around Jabalia, Beit Lahia, and Beit Hanun, are making the conditions of life untenable for the Palestinian population there. I condemn Israel's use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in densely populated area that has caused massive casualties and damage to residential buildings, schools, hospitals, mosques, and UN premises. United Nations premises are inviolable in all times. I reiterate my unequivocal condemnation of the widespread killing and injury of civilians in Gaza, including women and children, and the deprivation of essentials to survive. I'm concerned over what may amount to violations of international humanitarian law in the conduct of hostilities, including non-compliance with the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precautions in attacks and against the effect of attacks. The international humanitarian law always applies to all parties to a conflict, and its application does not depend on reciprocity. The protection of civilians is paramount. There must be full accountability for any atrocity crimes that have been committed. I mourn the United Nations personnel killed in Gaza and strongly condemn the killing of all health and humanitarian personnel and journalists. I also condemn the looting of aid in the context of a breakdown of law and order. These are unacceptable and must stop immediately. I reiterate my call for the full investigation of all such incidents and accountability for any violation of international law. Due to continued restrictions imposed by Israel, looting by armed Palestinians, and overall insecurity, supplies have entered Gaza at levels that are inadequate to meet the overwhelming needs of the population, including large numbers of IDPs living in extremely overcrowded conditions. To address the needs, the United Nations and its partners urgently require the predictable entry and unimpeded movement of food, shelter materials, medicine and fuel, and the capacity to repair essential life-saving infrastructure, including the healthcare system. Noting its opening of additional entry points for humanitarian aid, I call upon Israel to fulfill its obligation as occupying power under international law, including allowing and facilitating rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need into and throughout Gaza, and to create the conditions that will permit the return of Palestinians to their homes. I know the relative success of the polio vaccination campaign. While falling short of our targets in the north of Gaza, the use of tactical pauses and examples of functioning coordination with Israel demonstrated what is possible and achievable. I reiterate my call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire and the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages in Gaza. The United Nations is continuously engaged with all stakeholders toward these objectives and stands ready to support the implementation of an agreement. I welcome the continued efforts, including by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, to overcome the significant obstacles and reach a deal. I remain deeply alarmed by the relentless Israeli settlement expansion in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, that is fueling tensions, impeding access by Palestinians to their land, and threatening the viability of a future independent, democratic, contiguous and sovereign Palestinian state. I reiterate that all Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, have no legal validity and are in flagrant violation of international law and United Nations resolutions. I'm deeply concerned that over the past year, the government of Israel has continued to systematically promote policies that have strengthened the involvement of civilian officials in control over the occupied West Bank, including transferring some security functions to civilian control, while some government officials called for the annexation of areas in the occupied West Bank. I urge the government of Israel to cease all settlement activities immediately. I note in this regard the recent findings by the International Court of Justice in its advisory opinion of 19 July 2024, which declared inter alia that Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is unlawful and must end as rapidly as possible. The demolition and seizure of Palestinian-owned structures, including internationally funded humanitarian projects, as well as structures related to income generation and the provision of essential services, entail numerous violations of international law and raise concerns about the risk of forcible transfer. I once again call upon the government of Israel to end this practice and to prevent the displacement of Palestinians in accordance with its international obligations under international law, and to approve plans to allow Palestinians to build legally and address their development needs. The escalating violence and tensions in the occupied West Bank are highly concerning and could trigger broader explosion. Intensified operations by Israeli forces, increased settler violence and attacks against Israeli have also exacerbated tensions and led to exceedingly high levels of casualties, detentions, and destruction. I am alarmed by the lethal attacks carried out by Israeli settlers against Palestinians, including sometimes in proximity and with the support of Israeli security forces, and by Palestinians against Israelis. All perpetrators of attacks must be held accountable. I reiterate that Israeli security forces in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, must exercise maximum restraint and use lethal forces only when it is strictly unavoidable to protect life. I call on Israel to abide by its obligations under international law and to ensure thorough, independent, and prompt investigation into all instances of possible excessive use of force, holding those responsible to account. I'm particularly appalled that children continue to be victims of violence on all sides. I'm also concerned that Palestinian children continue to be arrested in large numbers and held for prolonged periods of time, including in administrative detention. I reiterate my call for Israel to use detention as a measure of last resort and for the shortest appropriate period to prevent all forms of ill treatment in detention and to end the administrative detention of children who are entitled to special protections. I'm disturbed at the numerous instances during the reporting period in which officials glorified violence and engaged in dangerous provocations, incitement, and inflammatory language, which will only lead to greater polarization and risks further bloodshed. Leaders have an obligation to clearly and explicitly condemn acts of terror and violence directed against civilians. The incitement to violence must stop immediately. I reiterate my call to the parties for the status quo at the holy sites in Jerusalem to be respected and upheld, taking into account the special and historic role Kingdom of Jordan as custodian of the holy site in Jerusalem. I'm deeply concerned with the adoption of the Knesset of Israel of 2 laws concerning UNRWA. These laws, if implemented, could prevent UNRWA from continuing its essential work in the occupied Palestinian territory, which would have devastating consequences for Palestine refugees, considering that there is no viable alternative to UNRWA which could adequately meet the needs. I again urge Israel to act consistently with its obligation under the Charter of the United Nations and its other obligations under international law, including under international humanitarian law and those concerning privileges and immunities of the United Nations. National legislation cannot alter those obligations. Madam President, it is vital that the international community provide immediate support to the Palestinian government to address its fiscal challenges, strengthen its governance capacity, and prepare it to reassume its responsibilities in Gaza. We must establish political and security frameworks that can address the humanitarian catastrophe, start early recovery, rebuild Gaza, and lay the groundwork for a political process to end the occupation and establish a viable two-state solution as soon as possible. It is vital that these frameworks facilitate a legitimate Palestinian government that can reunify Gaza and the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, politically, economically, and administratively, while reversing the steadily deteriorating dynamics throughout the occupied Palestinian territory. Any attempt to establish settlements in Gaza must be firmly rejected. There must be no attempt to reduce or annex the territory of Gaza in whole or in part. The devastations and misery of the past year have reinforced once again a simple truth. Palestinians and Israelis can no longer wait to establish a viable political horizon. Now is the time to lay the foundations for a better future for Palestinian, Israeli, and the broader region. Israeli-Palestinian, the states of the region, and the broader international community must urgently take steps that will enable the parties to re-engage on the long-delayed political path to achieve two-state solution. The United Nations remains committed to supporting Palestinian and Israelis in ending the occupation and resolving the conflict in line with international law, relevant United Nations resolution, and bilateral agreements in pursuit of the vision of two-state, Israel and an independent, democratic, contiguous, viable, and sovereign Palestinian state of which Gaza is an integral part. Living side by side in peace and security within secure and recognized borders on the basis of the pre-1967 lines, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Chiari for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Shira Efron.
Thank you, Madam President, and distinguished members of the Security Council for the invitation to brief the Council today. It is truly an honor. Especially at the United Nations, the birthplace of the plan to partition mandated Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, it is pertinent to acknowledge that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict remains a tragedy today for both Jews and Arabs. At the same time, it is also crucial to recognize, as the General Assembly did back then, that practical solutions exist and should be pursued. As an Israeli Jew, I speak from my lived reality. The trauma in Israel is palpable, the society still frozen in the horror of October 7, the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. On that day, Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists murdered over 1,200 Israelis and nationals of other countries, abducted 251, and committed atrocities, including large-scale sexual violence. Today, 439 days later, 100 people, including soon-to-be a 2-year-old toddler and an 86-year-old grandfather, remain in captivity in Gaza, while their families, as you'll hear in just a few minutes, endure daily torment. We are all praying for their immediate release. Border communities bear the scars of destruction and displacement. Israelis continue to face insecurity with ongoing bombardments from multiple fronts and terror attacks on our streets. In Gaza, devastation is unimaginable. Countless lives lost, families shattered, including of my dear friends Khalil and Ahmed. Homes reduced to rubble, and populations struggling for survival with scarce basic necessities like food, water, and healthcare. The West Bank, meanwhile, is gripped by rising violence and economic hardship. For both societies, the wounds of this war are deep and will take years to heal. Yet, even now, steps can be taken to halt the suffering and begin charting a path towards stability and hope for both Israelis and Palestinians. Madam President, the collective challenge before us as Israelis, Palestinians, countries of the Middle East, and the international community is to seize this moment of profound tragedy and turn it into a bold diplomatic process that leads to peace, security, and prosperity for people across the region. While international actors frequently invoke the language of a two-state solution with goodwill and intent, reliance on mere sloganeering and rhetoric has done little to build trust or address the structural dynamics of the conflict. And while we at Israel Policy Forum also view the two-state option as the only viable framework that acknowledges the legitimate national aspirations of both sides, and is the only way to guarantee the future that Israel's founders envisioned, a Jewish, democratic, and secure state of Israel, we realize that two-state reality will remain only a vision unless we change our approach. What is needed now is a coherent, inclusive, and actionable strategy that moves beyond rigid thinking so that we can end the war, stabilize Gaza, and shift trends in the West Bank from creeping annexation to peaceful separation. Regional actors should leverage the potential for normalization with Israel to empower pragmatic actors while countering spoilers. This moment demands a shift from platitudes to planning, with a coordinated roadmap that addresses security and governance, delivers tangible short-term wins, and lays the foundation for our shared long-term vision. Nowhere is that more apparent than in the discussions about the day after in Gaza. Madam President, as we anxiously hold our breath for a hostage and ceasefire agreement, there is still no shared coherent plan for a post-war Gaza. The international community sees basically one viable path out of this morass, establishing a transitional non-Hamas Palestinian administration in Gaza with the aim of eventually restoring full Palestinian PA governance once it is reformed and strengthened. Clearly, without a green light from the PA, regional and other international partners will not commit to Gaza's recovery. Yet, mostly for political reasons, whether we like it or not, the Israeli government has until now vetoed PA involvement, exacerbating the risk of either full Israeli occupation of Gaza or a Hamas resurgence, or both. Notably, this forum, it's important to acknowledge that despite extreme voices, most Israelis do not want to control the Palestinians in perpetuity, but they're scared and see no plausible alternative. To soften Israeli resistance, there is a need for a gradual, benchmark-driven approach with assurances that capitalizes on success stories, even if those are small. Existing PA capacity in Gaza can and should be mobilized for the humanitarian effort, for example, through relying on former security personnel and senior representatives in key government positions, including in the monetary and water authorities, with whom Israel already interacts today. Involving the PA and ensuring it has the capacities to succeed would also help alleviate fiscal and economic pressures in the West Bank, which is a deep concern for the Israeli security establishment. It would also incentivize sustained, more strategic donor engagement and enlist regional Middle East partners in restoring public order in Gaza's chaos. Further, consent for a meaningful PA role in Gaza should be explicitly leveraged to propel genuine PA reforms with clear objectives, a defined roadmap, and key performance indicators. The PA should demonstrate that it can really be part of the solution by reforming the so-called prisoner and martyr payment systems, creating a conducive environment for the private sector, strengthening judicial independence, reorganizing the security sector, addressing incitement, undertaking educational reform, and working toward a credible election horizon that allows for political participation of next-gen leadership. Without these reforms, realistically, Israel will continue to withhold tax revenues from the PA. U.S. restrictions on aid will remain, and regional states will be hesitant to invest in the Palestinian economy and infrastructure, which will further deepen the PA's fiscal crisis and legitimacy crisis, and jeopardize stability both in the West Bank and Gaza. For its own long-term interest and to enable the PA to succeed, Israel must also take critical steps to shift its policy in Gaza and in the West Bank. These include easing financial pressures on the PA, allowing it to the operational space to effectively govern and secure the territory under its jurisdiction, to free settlement expansions in areas that undermine territorial separation, and in those only, and taking decisive action to stop settler violence. U.S. leadership, security guarantees, and Arab-Israeli normalization can and should play a key role in driving these measures forward. There are no quick fixes to these long-standing issues, unfortunately, and the situation on the ground cannot wait for all our clocks to synchronize. Yet Israel and the international community should identify and amplify positive signals, such as Israel's decision to extend the indemnification for correspondent banking between Israel and the West Bank, as well as the current efforts by the Palestinian security forces to regain control of the refugee camp in the town of Jenin. Importantly, this initiative, alongside ongoing security cooperation and coordination between Israel and the Palestinians, even in the past 15 months, is the result of a long-term strategic international investment in the U.S. Security Coordinator, or the USSC. Building on such success stories is essential to both strengthen and improve the PA's capacity, while simultaneously alleviating Israel's legitimate security concerns. Madam President, so much depends on Israelis, Palestinians, the support of member states, and especially U.S. leadership. But the UN, as an institution, has an integral role to play as well. Effective UN capacity is necessary for the humanitarian response, for recovery and reconstruction, for stabilization, and for assisting the Palestinian state in the making, indeed, and not only in word. Internally, this requires tight coordination across UN agencies and between principals, streamlined funding, operational mechanisms, and strategic flexibility to step back from overly rigid approaches when pragmatism is needed. At the same time, the UN and Israel must repair their fractured relationship, which has reached unprecedented low. Both sides have legitimate grievances, but there is too much at stake to allow them to get in the way of efficient and forward-looking cooperation that is in both sides' interests. I will speak about the Israeli perspective. There is a long-standing sense of UN bias, compounded by what Israel sees as insufficient reaction to October 7 and its aftermath, and the evidence of UNRWA staff ties to Hamas. This trust deficit has real policy shortcomings of losing all support and leverage with Israel. Israelis need to hear an unequivocal UN condemnation of Hamas and its actions. And like the Palestinians, Israelis also need an international reaffirmation of the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in a state of their own and acknowledgement of the Jewish connection to the land of Israel. Neither side will be partners in a political process that we both need if that process denies the legitimacy of these rights. To conclude, just as it did when it passed the partition plan in 1947, the UN has an important role to play in helping Israelis and Palestinians move beyond what has been the darkest period in their shared history. This can happen by zooming in on what is possible and achievable rather than what is perfect, and focusing on the solutions rather than getting stuck on the problems. Thank you, Madam President and members of the Security Council.
I thank Ms. Efren for her briefing, and I now give the floor to Mr. Michael Levy.
Thank you, Madam President, and distinguished members of the UN Security Council. Today, I stand before you not just as Michael Levy, but as a brother, a son, a human being, and as someone whose life has been shattered by unimaginable loss and despair. My brother, Or Levy, is one of the 100 innocent hostages currently held by Hamas in Gaza. For 439 days, Or has been missing from our family. 439 days of fear, anguish, and an unbearable silence that echoes louder than any words ever could. On October 7th, Or and his wife Einab went to a music festival, seeking for a brief moment of joy. They arrived just 9 minutes before all hell broke loose. Missiles flew over their heads, and they had to run into a nearby shelter, thinking they will be safe. From that shelter, Or called my mother, repeating the terrifying words, "Mom, you don't want to know what's going on here." That was the last time we heard his voice. 10 minutes later, Hamas terrorists stormed the shelter. They threw grenades, sprayed bullets, murdered Einab, and kidnapped Or into the tunnels of Gaza. The last image we have of him is heartbreaking, covered in his wife's blood, shocked and terrified. Or is more than just a number. He is a real human being, a father to an amazing 3-year-old son named Almog, who lost his mother in the horrendous terror attack of October 7, and is now essentially orphaned. This baby had to celebrate his 3rd birthday without his parents. Try to imagine your own child celebrating his birthday without you, going through life's milestones without you. Imagine not knowing if your child is okay and who is taking care of him. Almog keeps asking about mom and dad, and even when we try to explain, he doesn't understand why he can't see his dad, and what it means when we say that mom will never come back. This baby still has a father who can come back to him. Do not let him become an orphan. You have the power to save his father. For 439 days, I've woken up every morning with a pit in my stomach, wondering where my brother is, wondering if he's cold, if he's hungry, if he managed to survive another day. Every moment he remains in captivity, is a moment of unbearable suffering for him and for all of us who love him. I'm here today to remind this council and the world of its duty, not just as diplomats, but as people, as mothers, fathers, siblings, and friends, because this is not merely a political issue. This is a human issue, a moral issue. I want to ask every member of this council, what would you do if it was your child, your brother, your loved one? Hamas's actions are not just blatant violation of international law. They are an assault on humanity itself. Holding civilians hostage, men, women, children, is a violation of the principles that this very council was created to protect. And yet, your silence is deafening. Your inaction is suffocating. For every day this council fails to act, the message to the world is clear, that some lives are worth saving and others are not. But I refuse to accept that message. I refuse to accept a world where my brother's life can be used as a bargaining chip and be forgotten. I refuse to believe that this council, which was created to uphold the highest ideals of humanity, will turn its back on those who need it the most. This is your moment to act, to lead, to show the world that this council has the courage to stand for what is right and send a resonating message that terror will never prevail. I'm asking you to prove that international law means something, that human rights are not just words, but principles you will fight to protect. Demand the release of all. Demand the release of them all. These 100 lives are not just numbers. They are fathers, mothers, daughters, sons, brothers and sisters. They are people with families waiting desperately to hold them again. I want to express my deepest gratitude to the American nation and all the rest of the nation that supported our campaign, for standing with us in this dark hour. Your unwavering belief in freedom and justice is a beacon of hope for families like mine who are desperate for a lifeline. And to President Trump and Biden, we place our deepest hopes and faith that you will bring this tragedy to an end. Your decisive leadership has already brought light into a situation that feels so hopeless. We believe in your strength, your leadership, and your commitment to justice to help bring our loved ones back home. I want to finish with a personal note. Today is my birthday, the second birthday I mentioned without my baby brother. I'm not asking for any presents, celebrations, or even a cake. My only birthday wish is sitting in a Hamas tunnel waiting to be brought back to his son. Bring my brother home. Bring them all home. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Levy for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me thank Assistant Secretary General Khaled Kiari for his important briefing on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334 and Dr. Shira Efron of the Israel Policy Forum and Mr. Michael Levy for their perspectives on the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. We acknowledge the Secretary General's report and regret that this reporting period is marked by continued hostilities between Israel and Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups in the Gaza Strip. This contravenes the provisions of Resolution 2334 that calls for immediate steps to prevent all acts of violence against civilians, including acts of terror as well as acts of destruction. As reported by OCHA, an estimated 26,000 of the wounded civilians in the Gaza Strip have suffered injuries that could lead to lifetime deformity and disability, especially among children. We note with concern the highest number of child amputees per capita in the world has been recorded in the Gaza Strip. In the same vein, we also recall that Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups have continued to hold the remaining hostages since 7th October 2023 without granting the necessary access or providing updates on their well-being. In Resolution 2334, Israel, the occupying power, is reminded of its legal obligations and responsibilities under the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949 relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war. However, the past 14 months in the Gaza Strip have presented compelling evidence that does not align with the provisions of the resolution. This is reflected in the current estimated death toll in the range of over 45,000 and the wounded at 106,000, with 70% of such casualties being women and children. The civilian population has been trapped in a deep humanitarian crisis at a scale and magnitude far beyond human comprehension. These statistics question our conscience and collective responsibility to advance durable peace and to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war as stipulated in the United Nations Charter. As families and communities are displaced due to the widespread destruction of their homes and critical infrastructure, the already vulnerable population in the north and elsewhere in Gaza are exposed to extreme weather conditions during this winter. What the Palestinians are currently experiencing represents a disruption of their livelihoods, social networks, and overall well-being. The alarming rate of violence in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, in the context of Israel operations, armed exchanges between Palestinians, including armed groups, Israeli security forces, and settlers, often leading to restrictions, forced displacement, and demolition, contravenes resolutions of this Council and the International Court of Justice Advisory Opinion of 19 July 2024. All of these actions on the ground seem to be counterproductive to the search for lasting peace in the Middle East. We are encouraged, however, by the increased political momentum in support of addressing some of the critical issues surrounding the Middle East peace process and the implementation of Resolution 2334. With that in mind, Sierra Leone welcomes the observations as highlighted in the Secretary General's report and would like to reiterate the following. First, we condemn the continuous killing and injury of civilians and the never-ending cycle of violence. To end this situation, we demand for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, respect for international humanitarian law, and implementation of Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, including the most recent General Assembly resolution ES 10/33. We also call for the unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas. We further reiterate our support for UNRWA and its pivotal role in supporting the Palestinians. We express concern that any action to undermine its operations will be detrimental for Palestinian refugees in particular, not only in Gaza, but across other areas of operations. We welcome the various initiatives by the international community, including diplomatic efforts by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, as well as the launch of the Global Alliance for the Implementation of the Two-State Solution. Sierra Leone recalls the ICJ advisory opinion of 19th July 2024 and calls on Israel to immediately and completely stop all settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, as they present an obstacle to peace and threaten the physical viability and delivery of a two-state solution. We further caution against any action that may threaten the economic, political, and administrative status of Palestine. We reject the escalation of violence in the occupied West Bank and call on Israelis and Palestinians to desist from all acts of incitement, inflammatory language, and provocations that may fuel tensions. In closing, Madam President, we urge the parties to recommit to a constructive dialogue embedded in the principle of the two-state solution while addressing the legitimate aspirations and concerns of both sides. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President, and I begin by thanking ASG Khari, Ms. Efran and Ms. Salivi for their briefings. Today we meet to discuss the latest SG report on Security Council Resolution 2334. This resolution underscores that Israeli settlements in Palestinian territory are in violation of international law and represent a significant obstacle to peace and the two-state solution. This position was further supported by the ICJ advisory opinion of 19 July, which called for the cessation of such activities. The international community's position is evident. On 18 September, the General Assembly adopted, with broad support, a resolution urging Israel to bring to an end its presence in the occupied Palestinian territory without delay. Despite these clear calls and legal obligations, Israel remains present within the occupied Palestinian territory. This constitutes a clear obstacle to justice for the Palestinian people. We have not failed to note during these 2 years statements and actions that appear to have as an objective the potential annexation of significant areas of the West Bank. These include measures to construct new illegal settlements, efforts to use the legal system to legitimize illegal outposts, and programs transferring administrative powers relating to land and settlements from military to Israeli civilian control. These measures are inconsistent with international law and hinder ongoing efforts to achieve lasting peace. President, at the same time, the unacceptable situation in Gaza is exacerbated by the obstruction of humanitarian aid and disruptions in aid delivery, as well as the breakdown of security. The northern Gaza Strip remains under effective siege. As we come to the end of our term on the Council, we will continue to articulate our clear stance on this crisis. We need an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire across Gaza and the broader region. It is equally crucial that this be accompanied with unhindered and sustained humanitarian access to deliver aid at the scale required to address the population's critical needs. We also reiterate our condemnation of the horrific 7th October attacks and maintain our calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Similarly, concerning is the rapid and steady degradation of the situation in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. We are deeply concerned about continued settlement expansion, settler violence, and the disposition and transfer of Palestinian communities. Recent escalations have seen a significant rise in demolitions and evictions, particularly targeting Palestinian homes and infrastructure. Additionally, settler attacks on Palestinian civilians, often carried out with impunity, have intensified, with reports of coordinated incidents in vulnerable communities. Such violence is compounded by restrictive measures on Palestinian movement, severely impacting access to basic services, education, and livelihoods. Illegal settlements, settler violence, and the presence of settlers itself remain among the root causes of most human rights violations in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. On top of being subjected to violent raids, women also face extremely limited access to maternal and reproductive health care, compounded by mental health challenges. These actions risk entrenching the occupation and further diminishing the prospects for a two-state solution. We call on Israel to reverse these measures and to uphold its commitments under international law. Inflammatory rhetoric on the future of the West Bank and the status quo of the holy sites must be avoided. The international community has a responsibility to promote accountability for violations of international law and to advance measures that foster peace and justice in the region. This requires addressing the root causes of the conflict and supporting mechanisms that ensure accountability. In conclusion, President, the international community must unite behind an irreversible realization of the two-state solution in line with relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. This must put an end to the illegal occupation and ensure that Palestinian aspirations for statehood and Israel's security concerns are equally fulfilled. Hand in hand with this, the international community's support to revitalize an economically sustainable Palestinian Authority as the sole representative of the Palestinian people must increase. The Authority's commitment, not only for reform, but also for keeping stability in the West Bank, particularly in refugee camps, should be sustained. This is the only way to bring a lasting end to unprecedented suffering and just peace to the region. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank ASG Carey, Dr. Afran for their briefings, and particularly Ms. Levy for his touching testimonies. Madam President, for more than 14 months, the region has been passing through its darkest moment, not only in Israel and Palestine, but also in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and beyond. The vicious cycle of a spillover has been engulfing the entire region with endless violence and instability. Now we are witnessing with both hope and concern some positive regional developments, including the recent ceasefire across the blue line and the political transition in Syria. However, the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory is not showing any sign of change. The Republic of Korea remains committed to its principled call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, along with the release of all hostages. Only this can save innocent lives, ensure humanitarian aid delivery, and create conditions for the reconstruction of completely flattened Gaza. Thus, we appreciate the never-ending efforts by the mediators and sincerely hope that the recently resumed negotiation can soon lead to a valuable outcome that stop the horror. Yet, we must be clear that ceasefire in Gaza will not be an end, but should serve as a true starting point for a better future for both Palestinians and Israelis. However, it is deeply concerning that over recent years, the world has been witnessing a negative trend that is hampering the vision of the two-state solution. As mentioned in the SG report, Israel has advanced, approved, or tendered for the last 2 years more than 38,000 housing units of settlements in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. These settlements will add tens of thousands of Israeli settlers in this area. Resolution 2334 affirms that the establishment of settlement has no legal validity and constitutes a flagrant violation under international law. Israeli settlements are also in violation of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which provides that the occupying power shall not deport or transfer its own civilian population into the occupied territory. Also alarming is that Israeli settlements, coupled with impunity, are laying the groundwork for settler-related violence toward Palestinian civilians. We are deeply troubled by the ongoing settler violence, including the September attack against a Palestinian primary school near Jericho, as well as numerous instances targeting the olive harvest, a key source of income for Palestinians. Israeli settlements activities, coupled with persistent confiscation of Palestinian lands, are also displacing Palestinians from their land. It is alarming that Israel's routine demolition of Palestinian homes is accelerating this displacement. Settlement-induced fragmentation of the occupied Palestinian territory is also obstructing free movement of Palestinians, another violation of fundamental human rights. And checkpoints, closures, and curfews compound these daily indignities. The most troubling aspect is that Israeli settlement activities serve as a major obstacle to the achievement of a negotiated two-state solution, slicing the territories controlled by the Palestinian Authority into numerous non-contiguous pieces of land. The Republic of Korea firmly believes that this solution is the only viable path toward a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace. The status quo one-state reality cannot be a substitute for this long-lasting aspiration. We once again stress our call that Israel should cease all settlement activities. To contribute to international efforts to reinvigorate the two-state solution, the Republic of Korea participated in the 2 rounds of meetings of the Global Alliance for the Implementation of the Two-State Solution. As reiterated during those meetings, the Republic of Korea will maintain its support for all relevant efforts, including its steadfast support for UNRWA, and reform the Palestinian Authority. We hope that Israel act more reasonably in reciprocating the call of the international community and supporting the work of UN agencies. Madam President, heading toward the end of the year holiday season, we wish for 2025 that brings a better future based on peace and coexistence, not only in Israel and Palestine, but also in the wider region. We hope that the ceasefire in Lebanon, albeit fragile, will be the beginning of the end to the widespread violation in the region. And thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Madam President. We commend the United States presidency for convening this session, addressing the ongoing situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. We thank Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo and the Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs for her comprehensive briefing on the implementation of the Security Council Resolution 2334. We are also thankful to the civil society briefers for the information provided on the matter. Madam President, Mozambique is deeply concerned by the persistent violations of Security Council Resolution 2334, the continued demolitions and seizures of Palestinian-owned structures, in the occupied West Bank, as documented in the Secretary General's report, represent a significant impediment to peace and stability. The ongoing hostilities between Israel and Hamas in Gaza have resulted in a devastating humanitarian crisis. The loss of thousands of lives, extensive civilian displacement, and systematic destruction of critical infrastructure aggravate an already dire humanitarian situation faced by Palestinian communities. Such actions, including the expansion of settlements, acts of terror and violence against innocent people, destruction of private infrastructure, constitute a blatant violation of international law. These developments systematically undermine international efforts to de-escalate tensions and pursue a comprehensive resolution to the Middle East conflict. We therefore call on all parties to immediately cease these destructive actions and create meaningful opportunities for constructive dialogue and peaceful resolution of this protracted conflict. We further call on the parties to refrain from the rhetoric of incitement to violence, inflammatory provocations, hatred, speech, and other provocative actions that can only fuel the conflict. Madam President, in conclusion, we call for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, the release of hostages, and the establishment of an impeded flow of humanitarian aid in line with Security Council resolutions 2712, 2720, 2728, and 2735. We reaffirm our unwavering commitment to the two-state solution, a vision predicted on the establishment of two independent sovereign states, Israel and Palestine, coexisting harmoniously side by side, each enjoying full membership in the United Nations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank ASG Chiari and Dr. Efron for their briefings. And thank you, Mr. Levy, for sharing your brother's story with us. The suffering you and your family have been through is unimaginable. Let me state at the outset that the UK stands with you and with all those hostage families seeking desperately to bring their loved ones home. We reiterate our condemnation of the abhorrent Hamas attacks of 7 October 2023 and the kidnapping of over 250 hostages. That includes Emily Damari and 3 hostages with UK links. The hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. Let me make 3 additional points. First, the worsening humanitarian situation in Gaza is appalling. Over 45,000 Palestinians have died since 7 October. And the last 2 months were the worst for aid since October 2023. The UN has reported a shocking increase in cases of acute malnutrition in children, and that Gaza now has the highest number of child amputees per capita in the world. The UK continues to urge Israel to do much more to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure and to abide by their international obligations. This includes facilitating rapid, safe and unhindered humanitarian aid and basic services to the Palestinian people. UNRWA plays a crucial role in delivering this life-saving aid. On the 11th of December, my Prime Minister committed an additional $16.5 million to UNRWA to support vital services for Palestinian refugees in the OPTs and the wider region, bringing the UK's support to UNRWA to $52 million since April this year. Second, President, northern Gaza must not be cut off from the south. The UK is clear. There must be no forcible transfer of Gazans from or within Gaza. There must be no reduction of the territory of the Gaza Strip. Israel's expansion of military infrastructure and the destruction of civilian buildings and agricultural land across the Strip is unacceptable. Third, the UK calls on Israel to stop settlement expansion on Palestinian land, which is illegal under international law, and to hold violent settlers to account. Continued instability and settler violence in the West Bank should not be tolerated by Israel, and the culture of impunity must end. This does nothing to bring about peace and security for Palestinians or Israelis. We also note the decision of the government of Israel to extend correspondent banking relations for 12 months and continue to urge Israel to remove its restrictions on clearance revenue. President, the fall of Assad and the ceasefire in Lebanon offer a moment of hope for the people of the region. We must now use this momentum to deliver a long sought-after ceasefire, secure the immediate release of all hostages, and put an end to the humanitarian crisis and suffering in Gaza. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señora Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam President. I want to thank Assistant Secretary General Chiari for his briefing, and I would like to reiterate the support of my country for the work of the United Nations and all its agencies. I'm also grateful to Madam Efron and Mr. Levy for their interventions. The first session on this topic, where Ecuador participated as an elected member of the Security Council, took place on the 5th of January of 2023. At that day, my country recalled that it was important to recall history to avoid repeating it, that in the past has caused so much violence, destruction, and death in Israel and Palestine. Since then, Ecuador has urged the parties repeatedly to refrain from actions of provocation or incitement and avoid acts of violence and terrorism, to stop the expansion of settlements on occupied Palestinian territory and control the violence of settlers, and respect the status quo of the holy sites of Jerusalem, and to implement the resolutions of this Council. Although these appeals have not been heeded, today we want to reiterate them because they are as valid now as they were then, because if those appeals had been heeded, today the situation would be different. The Sunday, the 8th of October of 2023, this Council held an emergency consultations. At that session, my country expressed its strongest and unequivocal condemnation of the terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas the previous day, and demanded that the hostages be released unconditionally and immediately. Since then, we have reiterated these words constantly. There is no possible justification for attacking innocent civilians, and these horrific actions are the direct cause of the war that continues in Gaza today. At that same occasion, Ecuador stated that the terrorist attacks of Hamas do not represent the Palestinian people or its inalienable right to free determination or its legitimate aspirations to live in security, freedom, justice, with opportunities and dignity. We warn that the grave escalation of the conflict would lead to the unacceptable death of innocent children, civilians, including women and children, that violence would lead to more violence, and this would aggravate the already precarious humanitarian situation that the civilian population was experiencing, which only made more incomprehensible the events of the 7th of October. We stated that at all times it was important to respect the principles of international humanitarian law, and it was necessary to avoid affecting the civilian population, that the right to defense was not a blank check for vengeance, and that it was necessary to stop the vicious cycle that has led to the current situation. On that 8th of October, Madam President, colleagues, my delegation stated, and I quote, that Ecuador will support in this council any measure or initiative that forces the parties to stop violence and resume negotiations, end of quote. Today, during the last session scheduled on this topic during our membership, I can say that Ecuador has fulfilled its pledge. My country has voted in favor of all the initiatives that have sought to achieve these goals. Some of them have been vetoed by some delegations, others by others, and the 4 that were adopted must be implemented. Today, Ecuador reiterates its call for the immediate implementation of these 4 resolutions that have been adopted: 2712, 2720, 2728, and 2735. We can no longer postpone an immediate ceasefire and the immediate release of all the hostages and the entry and distribution of sufficient and timely humanitarian assistance in Gaza. Madam President, I've stated this many times, and I will say it for the last time from this seat. The resolution of this conflict will not happen by force. Almost 8 decades after trying to do this without success, this should be evident. The only solution is to move towards a negotiated, peaceful, and definitive and just solution for the parties with the existence of 2 states, Palestine and Israel, on the basis of the 1967 borders and the relevant resolutions. For this, what is required is political will, courage, and long-term vision by those who are taking the necessary decisions. My country would like to express the hope that in a not-too-distant future, with good faith, these virtues that I mentioned prevail, and that both peoples at last can live in peace with dignity and in security, recognizing in each other human beings with rights and aspirations that are equally valuable. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Madam President, I thank Assistant Secretary General Chiari for his briefing and Dr. Efron and Mr. Levy for the perspectives they shared. Madam President, Guyana notes with concern that no steps were taken by Israel since the Secretary General's last report on the implementation of Resolution 2334 to comply with the provisions of that resolution. This ongoing stance of non-compliance is even more concerning, considering that the International Court of Justice has established that the Israeli settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem are violations of international law. The court further established that Israel has an obligation to immediately cease all new settlement activities and to evacuate settlers from the occupied territories. Despite these clear legal provisions, however, Israel continues to violate international law through both its policies and practices regarding settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory. In this context, the Secretary General's report sets out very clearly the violence and other human rights abuses that are the hallmark of Israeli settlement activity in the occupied Palestinian territory. Guyana therefore reiterates its call on Israel to strictly abide by its legal obligation as an occupying power to safeguard the rights and interests of the Palestinian people. Madam President, Guyana has taken note of the impact of Israel's settlement policies and practices on Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. We note, for example, the increasing number of fatal incidents and are alarmed that most Palestinians were killed by Israeli security forces in the context of Israeli operations. We have also taken note of the continuing incidents of displacement of Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, attributed to demolitions and other illegal activities by Israelis. It is unjust that Palestinians are forced to live with the constant threat of violence and even death by the Israeli security forces and Israeli settlers, even when they are engaged in routine activities such as picking olives from their olive groves. Guyana deplores these acts in the strongest terms and underlines Israel's legal and moral obligation to desist. Madam President, the Secretary General's account of the situation in Gaza remains a point of deep concern for Guyana, as it does for the international community. According to Gaza's health ministry, the death toll has surpassed 45,000. This is shocking in any context and would elicit urgent and strong measures from this Council were we to act solely based on our Charter mandate. It is deeply lamentable that the Council has been unable to achieve consensus to act for the Palestinian people, while hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians are killed, disabled, displaced, orphaned, widowed, starved, among other violations, the depth and scale of which no report can perhaps adequately capture. What would it take to stop the seemingly unending suffering and killing of civilians? The answer is clear: strong political will that translates into action to end the impunity with which the rights of the Palestinian people have been violated for all these decades. Madam President, we urgently need a political horizon to move us beyond the status quo. We already have the relevant frameworks established by the resolutions adopted both by the General Assembly and this Council. The international community must work unceasingly to unclench the fist that holds Palestinian self-determination, which have persisted since the birth of the United Nations. This continues to be manifested in cycles of violence meted out against the Palestinian people with impunity, in the denial of their requests for full membership of the United Nations, for recognition, and to chart their own political path, among others. In all of this, the two-state solution continues to be effectively undermined. We cannot allow this to continue. This Council and the entire United Nations membership must continue to spare no efforts towards a two-state solution. Madam President, I conclude by highlighting 4 points. First, we need an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza. We have seen media reports about a potential deal between Israel and Hamas, and we urge the parties to prioritize the lives of civilians and to cease the hostilities. We also reiterate our demand for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Second, Israel cannot continue to turn a blind eye to its international obligations concerning the Palestinian people. The illegal settlement activities must end, and Israel must repatriate all settlers from the occupied Palestinian territories. Additionally, member states must uphold their obligation to distinguish in their dealings with the State of Israel proper and Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory. Third, the Council must unite as one and uphold its Charter mandate. We must achieve consensus to end the impunity with which Israel has continued to violate all of the UN resolutions on the question of Palestine. Finally, we must deliver peace for the Palestinian people. This entails support for establishing strong governance by Palestinians for Palestinians, even as we take decisive measures to bring the Israeli occupation to an end. Peace must also entail a resolution of all final status issues, including the refugee question. On this latter note, Guyana reiterates its strong support for UNRWA's mandate, noting that unless the refugees are able to exercise their right of return, that mandate cannot be unilaterally brought to an end by Israel or any other party. Guyana commits to continue its strong engagement on the question of Palestine, with a view to contributing to a just and lasting solution for peace in Palestine and Israel and in the Middle East. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madam President, first of all, I want to thank the Assistant Secretary General Kerry for his briefing. I also want to thank Mr. Efron and Mr. Levy for their testimony. It's important for the Security Council to remain active in the face of the acceleration of Israeli settlement expansion in the West Bank and East Jerusalem in order to implement its own resolutions on this topic, including Resolution 2334. The position of France has been constant and is well known. Settlement activity is contrary to international law, and we condemn it. The International Court of Justice indicated in its advisory opinion of the 19th of July of this year that Israel had an obligation to put an end to its presence on occupied Palestinian territories as soon as possible. France will never recognize illegal annexation of territory or the legalization of unauthorized settlements. France implements a policy of differentiation set out in Resolution 2334, which aims to make tangible the legal distinction between the internationally recognized territory of Israel and the occupied territories. The policy of settlement building is a major obstacle to a just and lasting peace based on a two-state solution. It also constitutes a factor of tensions and violence on the ground. On this point, the policy of terror conducted by certain Israeli settlers against the Palestinian population in the occupied territories must end. As an occupying power, Israel has a responsibility to immediately take the necessary measures to protect Palestinian civilians. In East Jerusalem, the historic status quo on the holy sites must be preserved. In the Gaza Strip, the war must end. The suffering of civilians must end. France demands an immediate and permanent ceasefire. Madam President, our position is also unambiguous on another important topic. All hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. France supports the efforts of Egypt, the United States, and Qatar to achieve that goal. France condemns once again the barbaric terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas and other terrorist groups on the 7th of October of 2023. This Council must be able to do this unambiguously as well. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is catastrophic. It is essential to ensure full and unhindered humanitarian access to the Gaza Strip and inside the Gaza Strip. Populations must receive aid. During the humanitarian conference that took place in Cairo on the 2nd of December, the Minister of Europe and Foreign Affairs of France announced another $50 million of humanitarian assistance, including 20 million euros for UNRWA. Madam President, this Council has a responsibility to lay the groundwork for a political solution. We know that it requires the implementation of the two-state solution. France reaffirms its unwavering attachment to the security of Israel and the building of a viable, sovereign, and contiguous state for the Palestinians. France calls on the establishment of a reformed Palestinian Authority capable of exercising its authority over all the Palestinian territories, including in the Gaza Strip. Only a two-state solution will make it possible to respond to the legitimate aspirations of Israelis and Palestinians to peace and security. It's in this spirit that France will co-chair next June, together with Saudi Arabia, an international conference on the implementation of the two-state solution. This Council must act to respond to the urgency of the situation and to finally develop this political solution. The UN must play a key role in this process. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to start by thanking A.S. Chiari for his briefing and Ms. Efron and Mr. Levy for their testimonies. As always, today's meeting is a sobering reminder that peace in the Middle East, without an investment of astounding efforts, will stay elusive. The region is shaking. The trembles are affecting lives of individuals on a daily basis and without an end in sight. Madam President, in Gaza, strikes, including on densely populated areas, displacement and widespread destruction carry on in flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. They are coupled with extreme hunger, disease, severe limitations to humanitarian assistance, and attacks on and looting of humanitarian convoys and humanitarian actors. International humanitarian law is clear regarding the rapid and unhindered delivery of aid. Suffering of civilians is intensifying, including of hostages still held in Gaza. All of this are further exacerbated by complete absence of law and order. We repeat that only a ceasefire will pave the way to peace. In the occupied West Bank, the advancement of new housing units is appalling, and we underline our long-standing position on the illegality of settlements. They are a violation of international law. We underline once again, and in line with the ICJ advisory opinion, the occupation must end. The downward spiral in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, has to end. This includes demolitions and seizures of property. We deplore the intensification of settler-related violence, as well as killings and injuries, including during operations, demonstrations, clashes, airstrikes, and other incidents. We share the concern about the large number of Palestinians, including children, detained by Israeli forces and in administrative detention. Numerous reports of torture and other ill treatment, including sexual violence, are profoundly distressing. Access of independent monitoring bodies to detention facilities must be ensured. We are also deeply concerned over the deep economic crisis affecting the Palestinian economy, prolonging and deepening the humanitarian needs of the Palestinian people. We support efforts to address Palestinian government's fiscal challenges, strengthening its governance capacity, and preparing it to resume its responsibilities in Gaza. Madam President, Slovenia continues supporting the efforts and the role of the United Nations. We praise the work of the UN workers on the ground, including of UNRWA, to address the suffering of civilians. We repeat our call to the Israeli government not to implement laws concerning UNRWA. The agency contributes to the broader efforts towards achieving a two-state solution, which is the only just and sustainable solution for peace and security for both Palestinians and Israelis. We admire the dedication of UN representatives, and in this regard, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Special Coordinator Venesland for his work. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam President. I also want to thank Assistant Secretary General Khalid Kari for his presentation. We listened attentively to Madam Efron's presentation and the poignant story of Mr. Levy. Switzerland condemned the terrible terrorist attacks in Israel took place on the 7th of October, but unambiguously. Allow me first to raise one of the issues that have preoccupied Switzerland throughout its term on the Security Council, the protection of civilians, and in particular humanitarian personnel. Switzerland is shocked by the facts reported on this subject, among others, in the Secretary General's latest report on the implementation of Resolution 2334. According to the report, Israeli airstrikes killed several humanitarian workers on November 30th, including a Save the Children employee and 3 World Central Kitchen employees. These victims have to be added to the list of more than 330 humanitarians killed, the vast majority of them UNRWA employees. Since October 7th, 2023, tens of thousands of civilians have been killed, including in recent weeks. Switzerland condemns all attacks on civilians in the strongest possible terms. Respect for the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution in the conduct of hostilities are obligations under international humanitarian law. In Resolution 2730, drafted by Switzerland and recently endorsed by 115 member states, the Security Council reaffirmed the obligation to protect personnel and assets involved in humanitarian operations. This protection is all the more crucial in light of the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza. In particular, the civilian population is exposed to the risk of starvation, the use of which as a method of warfare constitutes a war crime under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Switzerland will continue to call for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire, as well as the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages. And we welcome on this point the efforts of mediation underway. And we recall the obligation to strictly comply with international humanitarian law, including the rapid, safe, and unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid to all those in need in Gaza. These same demands were endorsed by an overwhelming majority of member states in the General Assembly at the last meeting of the Emergency Special Session on December 11th. This testifies to a shared determination to put an end to this war and its appalling human toll. It is also a reminder of the central role currently played by UNRWA, whose mandate has been confirmed by the General Assembly since 1949 as the main humanitarian actor in the Gaza Strip, providing state-like basic services throughout the occupied Palestinian territory, and as an important bulwark against further destabilization of the region. Madam President, Switzerland supports the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice of July 19th, to which it contributed. The illegality of the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory, which has been going on since 1967, is beyond doubt. This occupation must cease as soon as possible. We deeply regret the lack of implementation of this resolution, 2334, as well as in general of the 4 resolutions adopted by this Council since the acts of terror of the 7th of October. Throughout the world, failure to comply with the Council's decision is synonymous with obstacles to peace, suffering for populations, and failed peace processes. A case in point is the situation in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, where violence is at an all-time high as a result of settler attacks and operations by Israeli security forces. Switzerland is also concerned by the violence in connection to the presence of armed groups, particularly in Jenin. It reiterates its call on all parties to respect their obligations under international law. Operations carried out in the West Bank must meet the criteria of necessity and proportionality and respect the right of every individual to life and security of person. All those responsible for violence against civilians and the deliberate destruction of civilian property and infrastructure must be brought to justice. Switzerland condemns the announcements by Israeli leaders, as recounted in the Secretary General's report, to expand settlements illegal under international law in the occupied Palestinian territory. These announcements are likely to further fuel the spiral of violence and are clear obstacles to peace. Madam President, allow me to conclude by reiterating Switzerland's full support once again for the two-state solution, which is the only possible option for Israelis and Palestinians to live side by side in peace, security, and dignity within secure and recognized borders in accordance with international law and internationally agreed parameters. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, I would like to thank Assistant Secretary General Chiari for a detailed briefing on the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, including the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. We listened very closely to Shiru Efron and Michael Levy. I would like to express our condolences to Michael Levy and to all of those who are held by Hamas and other terrorist groups, and we do hope that their release will come as quickly as possible. To our great regret, all of the efforts being made by the Security Council of the United Nations to have a ceasefire and release the hostages to date have been blocked by the United States, who, since the 7th of October of last year, used their veto 6 times just to make sure that the Israeli military operation can continue in Gaza, and therefore that the lives of hostages continue being endangered. It is our understanding that as a result, only 1/3 of the Israelis captured are now being used in the lists that are discussed by negotiators. And we do wish very much that ultimately you will be reunited with your brother. As regards the silence of the Council and our not condemnation of Hamas, we were ready to do that on the 18th of October 2023, but our American colleagues vetoed a draft resolution on that. And this is something they are not at all in favor of being reminded today. Distinguished colleagues, as is clearly can be seen from the statement made by Khaled Kiari, the Security Council Resolution 2334 is not being implemented. Israelis continues with their plans to build new settlements on the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. They use a fabricated pretext that supposedly that there are no construction permits, and this is used to systematically destroy Palestinian homes. This is a height of cynicism where the Palestinians who cannot afford to pay the high duties to the Israelis are then compelled to, with their own hands, destroy their homes. This is a mockery of human dignity. Continued illegal construction and the widening of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, undermines a negotiated resolution to one of the final status issues, namely territory and borders. This is in violation of Security Council and General Assembly decisions, including the September resolution, which came out of the 10th Emergency Special Session of the GA in support of the second advisory opinion by the ICJ on the legal consequences of the Israeli policies on the occupied Palestinian territories. Against this background, we are particularly concerned by the statement made by the Israeli officials about forcibly change the demographics of Gaza so as to recolonize the Strip. We are full of indignation as regards the passage by the Knesset of a law on deporting the families of terrorists, which gives Israel the right to send to Gaza those Palestinians who did not tell them about the criminal intent of their relatives. This way, according to the Palestinians, suspect Palestinians can end up in Gaza, where his fate will be either die from starvation or being bombed. And these are the laws that are being adopted by the country, which claims that it is the only democracy in the Middle East. We think such steps are unacceptable, as are unacceptable the public appeals by some members of the Netanyahu government to annex the West Bank. We categorically reject the policy of creating facts on the ground. The Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory is illegal in any event from the viewpoint of international law, and there is no justification for it. We call on West Jerusalem to immediately start implementing Resolution 2334 and to stop all settlement activity. Madam President, today many have been talking about the continued violence in the OPT and used horrifying statistics. Since the beginning of the escalation in Gaza, there are already 44,000 Palestinians who were killed, and these are the ones we know about. Most of them are women and children. And against this background of these horrifying factors, the West Bank statistics somewhat overshadows. But there, since October 2023 to October 2024, 736 Palestinians died, and this is when officially there was no military operation there. The life of Palestinians on the West Bank is essentially unbearable. The Secretary General the report is an illustration of the senseless and relentless violence on the part of Israeli settlers. On the 5th of October, 40 Israelis with rifles, clubs, crowbars, and pepper sprays started hunting for olive pickers. They beat up 25 Palestinians, broke their limbs, and cracked their skulls. There was a child who was a victim of this, a person with disability, a woman, an elderly person. After that, the entire harvest was thrown out by the settlers. And then the Israeli policemen arrived. What did they do? They, after all, are there to maintain the law and order in the lawful state, according to the Israeli authorities. They dispersed the Palestinians using stun grenades. Such an attitude towards Palestinians as second-rate people is unacceptable, and the international community has to insist on ending this monstrous policy by Western Jerusalem. The West Bank situation cannot be considered outside of the broader context of Gaza escalation. It's been more than a year that's been going on. Security Council members tabled many times a resolution demanding unconditional ceasefire in Gaza as a first step to stabilize the situation at the OPT. Unfortunately, the United States, as we already said, have been consistently vetoing these documents, stating that no one should impose a peaceful solution on Israel. We are not arguing the fact that Israel is a sovereign state. Do not question their right to ensure their defense. But we are concerned that the Israeli side use this right to justify not only fighting terrorism on their own territory, but also to impose a collective punishment of the Palestinian people in Gaza, West Bank, bombarding Lebanon, occupy Syrian lands. We get the impression that fully ensuring one's defense is seen by Israel as establishing a barren wasteland around them, targeted by Israeli tanks, drones, and fighter planes. And negotiating with Palestinians, Lebanese, and Syrians, West Jerusalem is planning to only do from the position of force and intimidation, expecting that Washington will also cover them and provide them with diplomatic and military support. But this is not a way to resolve a conflict. This is how to deepen them. If you push people to a situation where they have nothing to lose, well, don't be surprised when radical ideas become popular. Or don't be surprised when essentially there is a freeze of the process of normalizing relations between regional actors and Israel against the backdrop of Gaza. Instead of looking for solutions of problems, West Jerusalem is creating new ones, coming into effect early next year of the Knesset bills banning UNRWA will mean the end of functioning and the dismantling of a key UN agency to help Palestinians, to which there's no alternative. This is a direct violation of the Charter, General Assembly resolutions which determine the mandate of the agency, and international law. This is also a prologue to removing refugees issues as one of final status issues together with borders, water, and Jerusalem. The Israeli action in Gaza do not make us hopeful that Israel, as the occupying power, will take upon itself all of the UNRWA functions. Madam President, we believe there is an alternative to what is happening in the OPT, and the alternative is in the will of the international community, which is illustrated in the overwhelming majority who voted for the resolution at the 10th Emergency Special Session of the Assembly in support of UNRWA mandate and with a demand for a ceasefire in Gaza. The Russian position of principle on Middle East settlement concurs with the will of the international community. We call for an unconditional ceasefire, unimpeded humanitarian access, release of all hostages and those who are forcibly detained, and relaunching peace process on a generally recognized international legal basis. This is the only way not only to get to lasting peace between the Palestinians and Israelis, but also to remove the source of destabilization for the entire region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank ASG Hihari and Dr. Efron for their informative briefings. I'm also deeply grateful to Mr. Levy for his brave testimony. I express our great sorrow for the harrowing experiences you and your family have endured. Let me reiterate Japan's strong condemnation of the brutal acts of terror by Hamas and others, and demand for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Madam President, the Middle East is at a crucial turning point. While the situation in the region remains fragile, recent events have offered a ray of hope for peace. In Lebanon, Israel and Lebanon agreed to a ceasefire. Japan welcomes this achievement and commends the mediation efforts by the United States and France. All parties should take all measures to fully implement this ceasefire agreement and bring about stability. In Syria, the Assad regime has fallen. We need to follow the situation with caution, as it might be the start of a spiral of social unrest. Nevertheless, Japan strongly hopes this historic event will lead to fundamental and positive developments inside and outside of the country. The future of Syria, a future that has significant ramifications for the entire region, must be determined by the Syrian people themselves. Japan is committed to fully supporting an inclusive and peaceful Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political transition process leading to a lasting peace and stability. Madam President, we hope these evolving circumstances will help realize a breakthrough in devastating conflict in Gaza, where many hostages continue to be held and IDF's military operations remain active. The enormous number of casualties of innocent Palestinians and severe damage to civilian infrastructure in Gaza are totally unacceptable. The persistent humanitarian catastrophe is also intolerable. Israel's response to the situation appears inconsistent with its obligation under international humanitarian law. A ceasefire in Gaza and the release of hostages are long overdue. The dramatic expansion of humanitarian aid delivery is urgently needed, and for this purpose we need to continue the presence of UNRWA. At the same time, the agency should take steps to assure its neutrality. That is why Japan voted in favor of the two relevant General Assembly resolutions last week, which gained support from more than 150 countries. We urge all parties, including Israel, to listen to the voices of the international community. A negotiated settlement between the parties is also key to making a real difference on the ground. In this regard, Japan is encouraged by the reports of a resumption of the ceasefire talks and the seemingly forward-looking progress. We support the tireless efforts of the mediators. Both parties should seize the opportunity to finalize concluding the deal. But the ceasefire, even if it is materialized, does not mark the end of the tragedy. Tremendous challenges lie ahead to rebuild Gaza and provide for the well-being of the people living there. As a country that has experienced destruction and restoration after the Second World War and many huge natural disasters, Japan stands ready to meaningfully contribute to the early recovery and reconstruction of Gaza. Ultimately, the only viable way out of this conflict is the peaceful coexistence of Israel and Palestine. Japan remains steadfastly committed to this vision. We oppose Israel's illegal settlement activities and any attempts to annex the West Bank. These would undermine the viability of a two-state solution and must stop immediately. We will also spare no effort to revitalize the Palestinian Authority financially and politically, both here at the UN and through our own initiatives, equally after our current term in this Council is over. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Madam President, we thank Mr. Khaled Khiari for his comprehensive briefing. And we take note of the interventions of the civil society representatives. We extend our gratitude to the Secretary General for his sobering report on the implementation of Resolution 2334. It is a report filled with anguish and despair for the Palestinian people, a stark testament to the ongoing impunity with which the Israeli occupying power disregards international law. It also reflects the paralysis of the international community in the face of such blatant and systematic violation. This report is yet another painful reminder of our collective failure to uphold the right and dignity of the Palestinian people. Madam President, in Gaza, People are not living. They are simply waiting to die. People are not living. They are simply waiting to die. As the Secretary General himself recalled, the catastrophe in Gaza is nothing short of a complete breakdown of our common humanity. End of quote. The death toll now exceeds 45,000. 45,000. 70% of whom are women and children, with more than 107,000 wounded. The entire neighborhood in Gaza have been demolished. Today, violence, disease, and starvation are omnipresent threat. Humanitarian aid remain highly insufficient to meet the immense needs of the population. Quite simply, Gaza has turned into a graveyard for the living. As if these miserable conditions were not enough, the Israeli occupying army systematically hunts Palestinian civilians from one shelter to another. On December 15, just 3 days ago, 4 schools sheltering displaced families were bombed, killing at least 50 people. For those who doubted the gravity of the violation of the international humanitarian law under Israeli occupations, the facts presented in the Secretary General reports leave no room for ambiguity, leave no room for question. Objective observers will reach the conclusion that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. This is meticulously documented by Amnesty International in their recent report, pertinently titled, "You Feel Like You Are Subhuman: Israel's Genocide Against Palestinians in Gaza." So what will the international community do in the face of this genocide? Will it continue to perpetuate impunity? Will it continue to perpetuate immunity? Will it continue to obstruct international justice? Will it continue to deprive Palestinians of their fundamental rights? Is it not time for justice? Is it not time for accountability? Stopping the ethnic cleansing is for us a moral and legal duty. Madam President, a ceasefire in Gaza is long overdue. We deeply regret this Council's inability to demand an immediate, unconditional, and a permanent ceasefire. The Security Council would have acted decisively to fulfill its responsibility to maintain international peace and security. We cannot continue to look away. Madam President, the situation in the West Bank, including Al-Quds Sharif, is equally alarming. The Security Council, the General Assembly, and the International Court of Justice have reaffirmed that Israeli settlements and associated practices constitute flagrant violations of international law. Yet, settlement activity continues unabated. In 2024 alone, plans for over 13,000 housing units have been advanced. Meanwhile, Palestinians' houses are destroyed. Meanwhile, Palestinians live in terror of settler violence, emboldened by the protection of the occupying authorities. While we acknowledge the very light sanctions imposed by some countries against few settlers, this Council cannot remain silent. Furthermore, the daily killing of Palestinians, including women and children, underscores the relentless violence they endure. On average, one Palestinian child is killed every 2 days in the West Bank. A chilling reminder of the human toll of the Israeli occupation. Moreover, the Palestinian National Project now faces yet another threat: annexation. Annexation. We strongly condemn statements by several Israeli officials calling for the annexation of the West Bank, a clear violation of international law. It jeopardizes any prospects for peace. It undermines efforts toward the establishment of the State of Palestine. This very Council must stand resolutely against this plan. Mr. President, we reiterate our strong condemnation of the decisions adopted by the Israeli authorities aimed at halting UNRWA's activities in the occupying Palestinian territories. If implemented, these measures will utterly deny Palestinians access to the life-saving services provided by UNRWA. Let me be clear. UNRWA is irreplaceable. It operates in accordance with the mandate from the United Nations General Assembly, and it reflects the collective will of the international community. Any attempt to undermine UNRWA in an affront to the international community as a whole. We must all work together to preserve UNRWA and ensure it can continue its critical work. Madam President, in conclusion, developments in Gaza, in the West Bank, in the broader region, offer a stark reflection of the true intentions of the Israeli occupying power. Yet, the situation is dire, but not irreversible. This Council must rise to the moment, uphold international law, and ensure accountability for violation of the international humanitarian law. We owe it to the Palestinian people to translate our words into meaningful and decisive actions to bring hope where there is despair. As stated by President Abdel Tebboune, stability and security in the Middle East are closely linked to the resolution of the Palestinian issue, which requires the end of the occupation and the restoration of the Palestinian people's inalienable rights. The establishment of a sovereign Palestinian state with Al-Quds Sharif as its capital is not merely a legitimate aspiration of the Palestinian people, but the cornerstone for achieving lasting peace in the whole Middle East. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank SG Chiari and civil society briefers for their briefings. Last Wednesday, the GA adopted 2 resolutions by an overwhelming majority at its ESS, demanding the immediate, unconditional and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, the removal of obstacles to humanitarian access, and the guarantee of UNRWA's ability to perform its duties. Regrettably, in the weeks since then, hundreds more innocent Palestinian lives were lost to Israeli bombardment in Gaza. Currently, over 2 million people there are still languishing amid war, hunger, disease, and brutal cold, looking to the international community for the early dawn of peace. To end hostilities and relieve the disastrous situation, the Council has made great efforts. However, due to the repeated obstructions of a permanent member, the Council's responses on the Palestinian-Israeli question has failed the international community profoundly. We have noted the relevant countries' claim that a ceasefire agreement is about to be achieved. But the attacks and bombardment of Gaza haven't stopped, and innocent lives continue to be lost. China supports the Council in using all options in its toolbox and taking all necessary actions to end the conflict in Gaza, and urges the relevant country not to block Council actions anymore. At the same time, China urges Israel to heed the strong calls of the international community, immediately cease military operations in Gaza, fulfill its obligation on international humanitarian law, lift the blockade of Gaza and restrictions on humanitarian access, stop actions to strangle UNRWA and other humanitarian institutions, and provide security guarantee for the humanitarian operations throughout Gaza. President, as many national representatives pointed out in their GAESS speeches on the Palestinian question, piecemeal crisis management alone will not prevent the history from relapsing into a vicious cycle of conflict and turmoil. Only a comprehensive, just, and lasting solution to the question of Palestine can usher in real and lasting peace between Palestine and Israel and start a new chapter of peace and stability in the Middle East. China believes that we must stay committed to the two-state solution. The two-state solution is the only viable way to resolve the Palestinian question. The international community should stop Israel's barbaric expansion of illegal settlement in the West Bank and reject any dangerous attempts to annex the West Bank. Gaza is an inseparable and important part of Palestine. Its future arrangements should be predicated on Israel's withdrawal of the forces and should be decided by Palestinian people through autonomous consultation. The illegal occupation must end. History fully demonstrates that prolonged occupation will only be a hindrance to the Palestinian people's national self-determination and give Israel the power to single-handedly deny them the statehood. It will only breed more hatred and antagonism, sowing the seeds of instability in the Middle East. The Israeli occupation is a violation of the Council and GA resolutions and international law. Israel must fulfill its international obligation to immediately end the illegal occupation. An independent Palestinian state must be established. While the Jewish nation has long since had an independent state, the Palestinian people's right to statehood, survival, and return has long been ignored. Only when the two states of Palestine and Israel live in peace as neighbors can lasting peace be truly realized. China supports the establishment of an independent and fully sovereign Palestinian state on the basis of 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as capital, and supports the State of Palestine's full membership in the UN. Together with the international community, China stands ready to continue its efforts to help bring an early end to the conflict, restore peace in the region, and achieve comprehensive, just and lasting solution to the Palestinian question. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United States. Thank you, Assistant Secretary General Chiari, for your briefing. I also wish to thank Dr. Efron for your briefing and also for your recommendations. And Michael Levy, I want to especially thank you for sharing your anguish, your frustration with this council. We will continue our efforts to do everything possible to bring your brother Or home to his loving family. Colleagues, the United States is committed to finalizing a ceasefire in Gaza with the release of hostages that allows for a surge in humanitarian aid to Palestinian civilians. That is our North Star. And despite progress coming in fits and starts, despite progress feeling at times frustratingly slow, there is still a reason for hope. Thanks to the ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, Hamas is isolated. As we sit here, negotiators are in the region, working hard to close the remaining gaps between the parties. Now, let me be clear, I'm not starry-eyed here, but there are still difficult issues to resolve. We cannot give up on diplomacy. We cannot give up on the 2 million Palestinians in Gaza for over a year have lived through hell, a hell that was ignited by Hamas when it attacked Israel on October 7th. This was not an effort at peace. This was a declaration of war. And as we heard from Michael, we cannot give up on the 100+ remaining hostages, including 7 Americans or their families, who have also endured the unimaginable these past 14 months. Colleagues, granting Hamas, a terrorist organization, their demand for an immediate unconditional ceasefire offers no path to durable peace. It will not end the suffering or cycles of violence for Israelis and Palestinians. Instead, we must speak with one voice and demand that Hamas agree to release the hostages they are holding so that we can implement the deal on the table to end the suffering of hostages from more than a dozen member states and millions of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, and to put the parties back on a path toward a two-state solution. It also is time for Israel and the United Nations to stop working against each other and instead take pragmatic steps to ensure there is no interruption of humanitarian aid delivery to Palestinians in desperate need. We reiterate our concern that Israel must not in any way restrict the delivery of humanitarian assistance in Gaza, imposing obstacles that must be removed. Going forward, Israel must also ensure that the implementation of recent legislation does not further impede the delivery of humanitarian assistance and critical services, including by UNRWA, which remains a vital lifeline for Palestinians. Equally vital, as the aid delivery architecture in Gaza evolves, the UN must work with all relevant parties and have a viable plan in place to facilitate aid deliveries. The Secretary General's recent letter regarding UNRWA and the future of aid delivery in Gaza suggests that the UN has not yet begun an earnest conversation with Israel regarding implementation of the legislation. Nor does it appear that relevant UN agencies have had detailed conversations regarding steps they could take to help ensure continuity of UN aid deliveries to Gaza. With lives in the balance, this must change. The UN must demonstrate that it will continue to work to find a path to support the people of Gaza. Colleagues, cynicism will not end this horrific conflict, but bold leadership can offer the prospects of a durable peace, one in which Palestinians and Israelis live side by side with equal levels of dignity, security, and opportunity. To put a finer point on it, a durable peace between Israelis and Palestinians will only be achieved through a negotiated two-state solution consistent with this Council's resolutions. There's no other path that guarantees Palestinians can live with the freedom and dignity they deserve. And there's no other path that guarantees an enduring peace between Israel and its neighbors. This is a peace worth striving for, and it's one the United States has worked tirelessly to advance, even in the darkest hours since October 7th. And so even as we work to surge relief into Gaza right now, we must also think about a day after, one in which Gaza is reunited with the West Bank under the control and governance of a revitalized and reformed Palestinian Authority. Economic security in the West Bank offers a foundation on which the parties can build. In this regard, we welcome the Israeli government's recent decision to extend correspondent bank relationships between Israeli banks and their Palestinian counterparts for another year. It's a step in the right direction to help build trust and deepen economic links, but it's just a start. We need to see a resumption of the economic activities, including worker permits that ground to a halt following October 7th. We also remain deeply concerned that other Israeli actions in the West Bank undercut the Palestinian Authority's ability to meet the needs of the Palestinian people and more broadly dampen the prospects of a two-state solution. Colleagues, we reiterate our position that advancing Israeli settlements in the West Bank is an obstacle to the achievement of a two-state solution, the end state we all want to see as we seek to bring the fighting in Gaza to a close. Yet, more settlement units were approved this past year than in any other 12-month period this decade. We reiterate our belief that Israel's program of support for the expansion of settlements is inconsistent with international law and only serves to weaken Israeli security. We also remain deeply concerned about violence committed by extremist settlers in the West Bank. A disproportionate amount of this violence emanates from illegal outposts, several dozen of which have been established over the past year. To be clear, these outposts are illegal under Israeli law. The hundreds of violent attacks over the past year have forced Palestinians to abandon their homes and vacate more than a dozen of their villages. Even more alarming, last year saw the highest number of Palestinians killed in the West Bank since the UN began collecting data in 2005. We condemn the attacks by extremist settlers in the strongest possible terms and reiterate that Israel must intervene and stop them, or better yet, prevent them in the first place. To that end, we urge Israel to halt efforts to legalize outposts in the West Bank and to do everything possible to de-escalate tensions and hold all perpetrators of violence accountable, no matter the background of the perpetrator or the victim. Colleagues, I first addressed this Council on this topic in March of 2021 during my first presidency. I had just arrived at the United States mission to the United Nations just a few weeks prior. And I outlined 3 pillars of U.S. policy with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The first was to sustain our ironclad commitment to Israel's security. The second was to help both Israelis and Palestinians take steps toward a two-state solution, ensuring Israel's future as a democratic and Jewish state while upholding the Palestinian people's legitimate aspirations for a state of their own. And the third was to deliver aid to the Palestinian people. I said then, and I quote, "Let us strive to achieve peace and prosperity for all." So much has changed since that meeting nearly 4 years ago. So many lives have been shattered before, on, and in the months that have followed October 7th as a result of the catastrophic conflict that Hamas instigated. But now, like in 2021, the United States remains committed to bringing that cycle to an end. And so we will continue to work tirelessly to advance diplomacy on the ground. For a ceasefire with the release of hostages, for a surge of aid today and days after in Gaza that reaffirms the dignity, the security, and opportunity of Palestinians and Israelis alike, for a two-state solution and a new day for the next generation. Let us strive to achieve that peace and prosperity for all. Thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of Mozambique has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you. Madam President, I have asked the floor for the second time just to make a correction to the statement I just delivered. Our thanks go to Assistant Secretary General Khalid Chiari instead of Madame Di Carlo, as I mentioned by mistake. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their further statement. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the observer state of Palestine.
Madam President, let me at the outset thank the Council members who will be departing at the end of the year, namely Malta, Mozambique, Switzerland, Ecuador, and Japan, for their relentless efforts to uphold international law, including through achieving a ceasefire, the necessary prerequisite for everything else the Council has called to achieve. Allow me also to say that while we reject the U.S. resorting several times to the veto over the last year, I want to commend your personal engagement and your constructive approach, always seeking to move the needle in the right direction, in manners that the wider public is unaware of. Allow me also to thank the briefers to whom we listened carefully, and to thank the Secretary General and his representative Khalid Khayari, ASG, for the report on implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334 and for their diligent efforts. Madam President, another year is ending and the massacres have yet to end. The Council adopted a year ago, almost day for day, Resolution 2720. And still, a year later, starvation and famine are an integral part of the Israeli assault on our people. In Gaza, every Palestinian life has either been upended or completely ended. More than 150,000 casualties, Palestinian children, women, and men murdered, wounded, maimed by a ruthless Israeli military onslaught by air, land, and sea that continues as we speak, claiming more lives every single day. More than 17,000 Palestinian children have been orphaned or separated from their parents. Our children now represent the largest cohort of child amputees per capita in the whole world. Over 12,000 Palestinians are detained. Many of them have been abducted, subjected to torture, sexual abuse, and even killed. Thousands more civilians are unaccounted for. The torment of those who survive untold. Trauma and terror, destruction and devastations inflicted on the Palestinian people with no end in sight. A mass collective punishment unseen in our world in this century. Over a year ago, and from this same chamber, we called for a ceasefire that would allow Palestinian and Israeli families to be reunited in life, not death. We called for respect of civilian life, all civilian life. Let me repeat, we called for respect of civilian life, all civilian life, not preferring some over others. We warned of what would come if a ceasefire was not imposed. And yet, only a few weeks ago, another draft resolution put forward by the E10 and calling for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire, which enjoyed the support of 14 Security Council members, was vetoed by the United States. The General Assembly, acting under Uniting for Peace and taking action where the Council failed to demand this immediate and unconditional and permanent ceasefire. And we call yet again on the Council, if such a ceasefire does not come about in the coming days, and we hope it does, we ask you to act under Chapter 7 to demand an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. That is the only way to bring to an end to the massacres, to secure the release of prisoners and hostages, to ensure humanitarian aid reaches all those in need, to end the forcible displacement of our people and annexation of our land, and to ensure the full withdrawal of Israeli occupation forces. Madam President, this Council adopted 8 years ago the landmark Resolution 2334 to put an end to the land grab and to pave the way to ending the Israeli occupation and achieving a just peace. But unfortunately and expectedly, Israel persisted in pursuing its colonial agenda, flagrantly and wantonly breaching international law and UN resolutions. And this Council and all states are yet to adopt the measures that hold Israel accountable for its crimes, bring them to a halt, and reverse its unlawful annexation of Palestinian land. Since the onset of the occupation, Israel has confined Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory to the areas already built up and inhabited. Only 13% of East Jerusalem and 40% of the rest of the West Bank. The aim has always been to ensure that Israel could seize maximum Palestinian land with minimum Palestinians. But even that was not enough, and Israel decided to violently displace and replace our people, to forcibly displace Palestinian families and communities, to demolish their homes, to build settlements in the heart of our cities, and in a manner to destroy the territorial integrity of our state and to fragment our people and our land. The ICJ has stated in no uncertain terms, and I quote, "The sustained abuse by Israel of its position as an occupying power through annexation and an assertion of permanent control over the occupied Palestinian territory and continued frustration of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination violates fundamental principles of international law and renders Israelis' presence in the occupied Palestinian territory unlawful." End of quotation. The court called for an end of Israelis' unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory as rapidly as possible and reminded all states and the UN of their obligations in this regard. Only resolute action and measures of accountability by the international community as a whole shall lead Israel to stop its methodical destruction of the Palestinian people, of the Palestinian state, of the two-state solution, and of the prospects of peace in our region. In this regard, we await the report of the Secretary General, we expect in a few days, on implementation of Resolution ES-10/24 and ES-10/26 to inform future action by the membership. We will study it thoroughly, we hope you do, and then we will decide on the next steps forward. We welcome the launch of the Global Alliance for the implementation of the two-state solution and the decision of the General Assembly to hold a high-level international conference in June 2025, and I think my French colleague referred to it, on the implementation of the relevant UN resolutions pertaining to the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine and the two-state solutions. We call on all states to act without delay in line with their obligations under the Charter and international law to bring an end to Israel's unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory and to ensure the realization of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, including their right to self-determination and independence. Madam President, Israel, in parallel to its full-fledged assault against the Palestinian people, is attacking all those trying to support Palestinian rights and to save Palestinian lives. We have seen it with the UN and especially UNRWA. And we welcome the overwhelming support by the General Assembly for the agency in the face of relentless Israeli attacks. And we have seen it against international NGOs, most recently Amnesty International, following their report concluding that Israel is committing genocide in the Gaza Strip. And we have seen it against states, most recently against Ireland. The Israeli foreign minister closed the Israeli embassy in Dublin, stating, and I quote, that Ireland has crossed every red line. Really? So Israel continues genocide, starves and forcibly displaces a people, colonizes and annexes land. But it is Ireland which has crossed every red line for denouncing these crimes, for insisting on respect for international law and for human rights. You must be kidding me. How much more absurd can this situation get? How much more indecent can Israeli officials get? Israel has now accused the UN, almost every state on earth, the ICJ, the ICC, the world's most renowned NGOs, public figures, and moral voices of our time of anti-Semitism. Jews around the world cannot be held responsible for Israelis' actions, nor can Israel speak in their name or use them as shield to deflect condemnation of its violations. We reject this deliberate conflation between the actions of a state, or should I say the crimes of a state, and those who belong to a given faith. And we should all consider that this is dangerous and a terrible disservice to the fight against anti-Semitism and must demand it stop. Ireland and other countries around the world have shown that they will not be deterred nor distracted by Israelis' baseless attacks and smear campaigns. They will hold to their principled positions despite the bullying, threats and harassment. We salute all those who are standing up for freedom, justice and peace, many informed by their own histories and their own struggles, and are pushed to action by their commitment to international law and to human rights. Madam President, those who think they can end this conflict by taking more Palestinian lives and unlawfully colonizing more Palestinian land, or that they can bypass or ignore the Palestinian question and somehow establish peace in our region, are delusional. They are ignoring 77 years of history that demonstrates that there is no way around the Palestinian issue, and that there will be no peace in our region without the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine. Let me repeat that there will be no peace in our region without the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine. We are out of time, but are not out of options. We are not powerless. Occupation, war, and death are not our only horizon. But we all need to take the required actions to bring them to an end. No more delays, no more excuses, no more half measures, no more strong speeches and weak actions. Let me repeat that. No more strong speeches and weak actions. Action speaks louder than words. This is a time to show resolve, to be guided by moral clarity, and to lead by example. We call on each state to examine what more they can and must do to uphold international law and to implement UN resolutions. And we tell them they have a responsibility before history and humanity, for our people, for all peoples, to act now so that freedom, justice, and peace can prevail. Act now to end the massacre and genocide in Gaza, to end the ethnic cleansing and apartheid, to end this illegal occupation, to end the conflict and to achieve peace. We ask for nothing more than the rights international law guaranteed to our people. But we also cannot accept anything less. The Palestinian people need your continued support and solidarity, now more than ever. Please do not forsake them. And I thank you very much, Madam President.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank Assistant Secretary General Chiari and Dr. Efron for their briefings. I would like to thank the United States for allowing the voices of the hostage families to finally be heard in this council. Michael, thank you for your brave and incredibly powerful briefing. We will do everything we can to bring your brother and all of the hostages home. I must note my disgust at the fact that the Algerian representative could not bring himself to acknowledge Michael and the pain he suffers every day because of Hamas, or even mention the crimes of Hamas in Gaza. As we have reached the end of a very long year, I would like to ask you all to cast your minds back to these past 12 months. The pain and suffering felt by so many, including the families of the 100 hostages still held by Hamas, and the sacrifices made to protect the innocent from terrorists. However, this was also 12 months of immense transformation, and ahead of us lies opportunity. In 2024, the Middle East has become virtually unrecognizable. We continue to dismantle Hamas, and we continue to eliminate any threat that they may pose, and rid Gaza of their terrorist oppressors. Moving north, Hezbollah, once Iran's most vicious and dangerous proxy, has been heavily degraded. Arch terrorists, you remember those names: Yahya Sinwar, Muhammad Def, Hassan Nasrallah, Ibrahim Akil, and dozens of others who have caused unimaginable suffering to millions, not only Israelis, have been eliminated. Now, the Assad regime, responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of his own people, has crumbled to dust. It is obvious to all that these are not isolated events. They are all connected, and together they present an extraordinary opportunity for this Council and the world. The chance before us is clear, the chance to finally end the Islamic regime of Iran's aspirations for a Shiite supremacist empire, the chance to liberate the world from the most corrupt, most violent, most destabilizing regime. Israel has acted decisively. We have struck the terror networks that once cast a shadow over our region. But the burden of securing peace does not rest on Israel's shoulders alone. Iran's provocations continue to escalate, with shameless threats about its nuclear ambitions. Its proxies in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Iraq remain active and deadly, spreading chaos far beyond the region. This is not a localized threat. The Islamic regime of Iran is a danger to the entire world. The recent report from the International Atomic Energy Agency on Iran's nuclear progression, alongside the recent letter from the UK, France, and Germany, highlighting Iran's, and I quote, significant non-compliance, were cries for immediate action. This is not about hypothetical future. The danger is already here, looming on the horizon. The time to act is now. This Council must implement crushing sanctions to suffocate Iran's ability to fund its proxies. You must designate the IRGC, its tentacle of terror, as a terrorist organization. These steps are not optional. They are imperative. The Islamic regime thrives on inaction and indecision. If you fail, if you be silent to act decisively, you are complicit in enabling the campaign of terror. Let me be unequivocal. Israel has no intention of occupying Syria or parts of Syria. We are not empire builders, we are defenders. Defenders of our people, our borders, and our right to live in peace. Our actions are limited and defensive. Madam President, we are now approaching the holiday of Hanukkah. It is a time of reflection and resilience, a time to draw lessons from history. Hanukkah tells the story of two miracles. The first, of the oil lasting for 8 days in the temple. It was a divine act beyond human control. But the second miracle, the triumph of the Maccabees over the mighty Greek Empire, was a statement to human courage, to the will of a small but determined people who refused to bow to tyranny. Just 2 weeks ago, we saw a cruel and evil regime also overthrown by the determined population which it had oppressed for decades. We all know what Assad did to his people. And now I want to approach and tell to the brave and the ancient Iranian people. I say to you directly, to the people of Iran, do not miss this rare historic opportunity. Take action now. The people of Israel stand by your side. And I will approach you in your language. Marduma Iran in forsata nadare tarihira as das nadahid. Akdam kunid. Marduma Israel darkanara shuma hastand. I am telling to the Iranian people, we know the cost of freedom and the courage it demands. Your fight is not just for yourselves, but for the millions of lives the regime has destabilized and destroyed. In your hands lies the power to restore the beautiful Iranian nation, to rebuild a land rich in history, culture, and resilience. Madam President, as we reflect on the hope of Hanukkah, we must also confront the unfinished work before us. The scars of terrorism remain fresh. There are still 100 hostages held by Hamas in Gaza, enduring conditions that are beyond comprehension. As we speak, Israel is negotiating for their freedom. Hamas's crimes against humanity are despicable, and yet much of the world remains silent. Colleagues, while we dismantle Hamas's terror network, we continue our humanitarian efforts to ensure aid reaches those in need. Hundreds of trucks enter Gaza on a daily basis, as the total aid amount has now reached 1.2 million tons. Just this past Saturday, we coordinated the entry of 5,000 liters of fuel to operate essential hospital systems. Alongside the fuel, we delivered hundreds of boxes of medical equipment and food. Additionally, 36 patients and caregivers were transferred to more stable hospitals in Gaza. Yet, look what happened on the same day. As we delivered life-saving medical aid to Gazan civilians, Hamas terrorists fired rockets just 50 meters from an international aid warehouse. That's the reality we are facing. We will continue to do our work. We will continue to open new aid crossings. we will continue to facilitate aid with our international partners. As we conclude this painful yet transformative year, Israel looks to the future. Each of us are intelligent enough to recognize that there are two sides at this table, and let's be honest about it. One side truly desires a constructive, meaningful, and peaceful future. The other side, however, uses this conflict as a tool to promote their own agendas. Some use it to distract from their conflicts in their own corner of the world. Some use it to sustain their failing organizations, and others use it to serve their domestic political interests. Ultimately, Israel will remain clear-eyed. We will bring back all of our hostages. We will continue to do what is necessary to see that peaceful, constructive future realized, regardless of the noise, the bias, and the agendas we see play out in this room and beyond. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Israel for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.